Hello, it's Amy, and I'm here with another work by Honoré de Balzac. I've made it to volume 2 of my 25 volume set of the complete works of Honoré de Balzac. And I've just finished reading a novel. It stretches about 200 pages, and we use the term novel in a very loose way. Certainly Balzac intended it to be a novel when he fit all these puzzle pieces together, all these fragments together that had previously been published separately, and form them together into a novel. But it's a novel in a very loose way. It's something of a character study, but given that he wrote the pieces between the years of 1828 and 1844, it is a little bit disjointed. The translation is by Ellen Marriage, and I don't think it's through any fault of hers that it seems disjointed, because her translations are generally very good. I'm sort of going on the assumption that some of these issues are emerging in the text because Balzac chose to meld these different pieces together. The one consistent thing about the novel is that it does follow a young woman by the name of Julia. We first see her stepping out of a carriage, or rather being lifted from a carriage. She is referred to as a child. And I'm going to be honest, when Balzac said a child, a girl, I sort of pictured, a girl maybe of the age of 5 or 6. Especially because her father is lifting her delicately and elegantly without crushing her dress from the carriage step down to the pavement. But then Balzac does this thing where he mentions that a lot of men are looking. And so I thought, well, I would hope this child is a bit older. I'm guessing she's probably a young teenager, 14, 15, something like that. But of small stature, because then Balzac has this little scene where the father sort of slows down and tries to act very stately, and he sort of whispers to his daughter, they're all staring and they're jealous of me because they think I'm your husband. So there's this very odd dynamic where the father is proud that people are looking at his daughter. We first meet Julie when she is on the way to see this grand procession. It's Napoleon's army that's leaving Paris, and she wants to be there to see the emperor go by. But it's not so much the emperor that she's concerned with. Rather, she wants to see a young man, a young colonel, who she is very much in love with. And we get this conversation between her and her father, where her father comes to the realization that his daughter is in love, and then warns her against this man and says, he seems fine, but he's not very bright. He doesn't have a lot of ambition, and he's probably going to, stay where he is in his rank. He's not going to rise, and you are going to be very unhappy. And then we do a massive time jump, where suddenly Julie is married in the carriage with her husband, with the colonel that she is married, and her father is dead, and he is her husband is dropping her off at the house of his aunt. And I'm a little bit disappointed here because we didn't get very much time with the aunt. Balzac had really just established the existence of this very close relationship between the two women when he sends Julie back off to her husband in Paris and kills off the aunt. But the novel is really, these 3 or 4 different works all kind of interlocked together, but not specifically edited or tailored to fit together. Rather, it's almost like Balzac took them as they were and plunked them down one after another, just to put them together, which does lead to a few issues. There's switches in narration, there's changes in perspective. In one instance, at least one instance, and I don't think this is the fault of the translator, I think this is on Balzac, there's a change in tense. All of a sudden we go from past tense to present tense for a period of time. There's an instance where we go from, this third person perspective to all of a sudden there being an I. And so it's a little bit clunky in that sense. What the story is really about Julie's experiences and Julie at different stages of her life. As I said, we first see her as a child, a young woman with her father, unmarried. We then see her married and miserable because she learns pretty quick in her marriage that her father was absolutely correct and she should not have married this man. But here she is, married to him, feeling that he should be more of a brother to her than a husband. And we see her as a young, depressed mother. We see her as a depressed invalid. We see her becoming vibrant again. We see her in love, but in distress over this idea of duty and what it means to be a woman. And then we see her as an anxious mother who may or may not be in love with her husband again. An anxious mother who has been indifferent to her children for most of the novel. We see her as an anxious mother trying to make sure that her daughters don't experience the same things that she did in love and marriage. Because from her perspective, there's this strain, this tensity between love and between duty. And Julie will follow duty to the grave. It's all about ensuring that she is doing the right thing by the standards of society, by the moral compass that she's been given. She starts off with just one child that is born out of duty, her oldest, Helene, and then it's somewhat hard to keep track of all the different children because of these time jumps. In one section, she's got one child, just Helene, and then she's got a son that seems to come out of nowhere with no explanation, and then all of a sudden in another scene there's like 3 or 4 children. And then we have this sort of bizarre interlude in the story where we leave Julie behind for the most part. Julie is present for the beginning of this little story, but then we follow the eldest daughter, Helene. It's this kind of, it's probably the most fun part of the story, but it's really discongruent with the tone of the rest of the novel, because the rest of the novel is about Julia and her life, and then suddenly, one evening, a murderer takes refuge in the family home. He says he's only going to stay for 2 hours. They've never seen this man before, and Helene lays eyes on him, decides that she is in love, and decides something to do with, the indifference of her mother, because her mother is mourning the death of a lover. She became indifferent to her children somehow. Helene decides that she's going to run off with this murderer. And then just by chance, a few years later, the father of the family encounters Helene when his ship is overtaken by pirates, by privateers. And it's just through chance that his daughter's husband or lover, I don't know if they're officially married, recognizes him as Helene's father, and he's spared, and he sees that Helene has been living this extravagant wealthy life as essentially a pirate's wife for the last 7 years, and her husband is her entire world. She sees no one else except for her children, and she's found this idealized marriage, but that eventually cracks because we see Helene, later on in despair without her man, and it's, another tragic ending. And we get a lot of tragic endings in this novel. We see Balzac's characterization of marriage as something that's going to be a difficult experience for most women, something that's going to make them absolutely miserable, but that's just the way of the world, and they have their duty, and it's their cross they must bear. And everyone, essentially all the women in this novel, end up miserable and then eventually dead. Well, except for one woman. I think there is one woman who lives, but of course we foresee that she's going to be miserable as well. And I think the problem here is that we have hints of Balzac's usual skill, his usual subject matter, but it's pieced together poorly, and we're missing his usual structure and skill, just making it overall a disjointed novel, and certainly not one that I would recommend reading. It's almost as if we get too much of the subject matter that we wouldn't necessarily be interested in, and not enough of what we would So for instance, there were a few little sections, a few little scenes where I was just starting to get into the story, and then Balzac pulls us out of that. So for instance, shortly after Julie is married, she goes to her husband's aunt's place, and she is, very depressed and dejected at first because she is, well, at first the aunt thinks that she's missing her husband, but then we find out that it's not so much that Julie is missing her husband, it's that she is unhappy in love. She loves her husband, loves this idea of duty, but also can't stand to be around him, can't seem to stand the intimacy that's expected in marriage. And she would much rather be alone, and it's this thought that her husband is going to show up anytime that is absolutely wrecking her peace. She's only really at peace when she has no expectation that her husband could show up. It's almost as if she wishes that she were a widow already. But we have this subtle friendship starting to build between Julie and her aunt. And at one point, she sort of cries out, asking her aunt to be like a mother to her, to be her mother. And I would have been far more interested in the relationship between these two women than in the relationship between Julie and her husband. But, it's a Balzac novel. And from what I've seen in Balzac so far, we don't really get to look at the intricate relationships between women. Balzac is all about the relationships between men and women. And up to this point, I haven't really seen him look at the relationships between men or the relationships between women. Balzac is certainly all about that matrimonial and romantic love. Another example of something that I would have liked to see more of is Helene. We get this small interlude where we suddenly see her as a grown-up. 1 minute she goes from being like 3 or 4 years old to being 13 and running away with this, murderer who's entered the household. But we really only get a very tiny picture of her life, and it would have been, I think, very interesting and very fun to follow what happened in those 7 years of her life when she's run off with this man she's just met and is living as the wife of a privateer on a ship that is really just, like 25 men all living together who apparently all respect her and will literally throw anyone who makes a comment to her overboard, and who are administered to when they're ill by her. And it's almost this sort of Peter Pan style thing going, if Wendy had stayed in Neverland with the Lost Boys and with Peter, you could almost imagine this sort of scenario. But that happens, but it's a very small piece, and we leave Julie behind for a number of years before we come back to her as like a 50-year-old woman. We get a small glimpse of Julia's romance, but not enough of a glimpse. We see her taking a walk with a doctor who's been helping to bring her back to health when she's going through this period of depression and intense illness. And we see that the doctor is in love with her. She's in love with the doctor. We see her have some sort of romantic relationship with another man later in life. It seems to lead to the death of one of her children who has an accident. But to be honest, it wasn't entirely clear to me. There's a couple of lines about a child, sinking into the canal, into the river, into the mud or something, and there's no chance of him being saved. And her daughter, Helene, watching. I think it was, this 5-year-old son, which surprised me because up until this point, there wasn't really much of an indication that she had other children until suddenly, she's with 2 children. And I said to myself, oh, when did she have a second child? And apparently she ends up with 4 total, or maybe even 5, because I think there's 2 adult sons there's 2 sons that live to adulthood. There's the one that dies in childhood. There's Helene, who runs off at the age of 13. And then there's another child, another daughter, who is her mother's favorite and sort of her greatest hope, and the daughter that she hopes she can save from some of these pitfalls that she herself experienced in marriage, but who she is ultimately unsuccessful in saving, at least from her perspective. But yeah, we don't really get the full perspective on her romantic relationship. We are given to understand that there's nothing sexual about these relationships. There's no, intimacy happening. There's not even, many words exchanged. It's all looks and this hidden understanding and words that would seem innocent that could be interpreted, and just her behavior and spending time with these men. And this is all like, she never crosses that line because she has this intense sense of duty. And I think you can read the novel in two ways. You can say, the duty was her downfall. It's a shame that she wasn't able to let go of this sense of duty and to love. Or you can look at it in another way, which I think this is my interpretation of it. There really are no happy endings regardless of what she does, because we see it illustrated in her two daughters who go on to make separate choices. One of her daughters, marries a wealthy man of position, essentially takes on the kind of life that Julia herself has had. But Julia realizes that her daughter is also somewhat unhappy in her marriage and is engaging in an affair of some sort. There's this scene where she realizes her daughter is probably about to embark on some sort of affair because she's reached that stage in her marriage. She's reached, however many years before Balzac seems to think it's likely that a woman is going to have an affair in her marriage. And Julia brings her daughter into the parlor and says, I need to have an honest conversation with you. She's not well respected by her daughter. She's sort of lost her daughter's respect because of the situation that happened when the daughter was young. But she brings the daughter in and realizes in a very subtle gesture where the daughter calls the maid and asks her to run into town and pick up a hat or a garment or something herself, that it has nothing to do with the hat or the garment, and there's probably, a man hidden somewhere, or a man that's about to come, and she is hinting or gesturing to the maid not to allow this man into the presence since the mother is there. And so it's this sort of moment of realization where she realizes she is far too late to prevent her daughter from sort of making the mistakes that she feels that she made. But on the other hand, we do have the daughter who took the impulse of the moment and really went with this love, but that also ends very, very badly. It ends badly for everyone involved, whether they go for the duty or the love. It just seems to end badly. And I think that's something that comes up time and time again in Balzac's works, this idea that marriage and duty are difficult things that are probably going to make women miserable. So I think the long story short here is that A Woman of 30 is one that you can definitely skip if you are coming to Balzac for the first time or just setting out to read a bunch of Balzac. This is not one that I would particularly recommend. There are many other works by Balzac that are much better, and it's certainly not worth it to trudge through all 200 pages of this novel. So I will leave it at that, and I will see you again soon with another video on the next piece by Balzac that's in this volume, and that is called A Forsaken Lady.